Is it 2 o'clock, Max? What do you got, 2 o'clock? Do you have 2 o'clock? Yeah. Hey everybody, I think I'm gonna go ahead and get started. It's just now 2. As usual, I put together a slightly longer presentation probably than our window, so I'm gonna talk really, really fast and try and blow through it as quickly as possible, and hopefully leave a little bit of time at the end for some questions. For those of you, well, hopefully you can all read this, but my name is Haden Blackman. I am the president and chief creative officer for Hangar 13, which is a studio that's wholly owned by 2K. We have 4 sites across the world, one in Prague, one in Brno, one in Novato, California, and one here in Brighton. Very, very happy to be back here. I did a talk last year as we were opening up the Brighton site, and just really humbled to be asked back, and this time to kind of talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is story and storytelling in games. A little bit about my background. I started in the industry at LucasArts. I worked there for about 13 years. I was hired in as a writer. I became a producer, a voice director, a content supervisor, creative director. I touched pretty much every game that was released over that 13-year period, if it had Star Wars in it at all. I worked on Knights of the Republic, Galaxies, and ultimately was the project lead and lead writer on the Force Unleashed franchise. I also do quite a bit of freelance writing. I've written for every major comic book company, including Marvel, DC. I'm doing a creator-owned title for Image Comics right now called Echolands. And then a couple years ago, I was asked to join 2K to start a new studio, which became Hangar 13, and our first title was Mafia III. And I'm still at Hangar 13, and as I said, we're expanding. We just opened up in Brighton last year, and we are working on a couple different projects, including original IP, which I'm incredibly excited about and can't really talk about yet, but there's a lot going on there, and a lot of it involves story. Because at my heart, I think, for me, the thing that is so appealing about working in games is the ability to tell different kinds of stories and bring together the developer and the player as kind of co-authors of the experience. And I've spent, especially the last couple of years, thinking about this long and hard and trying to figure out how do we do that better as an industry. So one of the things that we're doing at Hangar 13 right now is we've created what we call a director's checklist. It's actually 11 things that we use as kind of a litmus test for all of our games, but they boil down into 2 big buckets, and it's really to drive home that notion that we're very focused on the co-authorship of the experience. So the first is everything tells a story, and I'm going to talk a lot about how we're trying to achieve that at Hangar 13 today. And then the second is every player's story is unique, and this used to be our kind of sole tagline at Hangar 13, and we've now expanded it to include both these things because it's that marriage of kind of the developer-authored story and the player-authored story that I think makes our industry so special. So before I get into too much about kind of some of the tools we're using, I want to talk a little bit about what I mean when I say story. I think it's one of these things that gets thrown around a lot and is often confused in the industry. I break it down into 2 big buckets. The first is the narrative itself. And the narrative is kind of what everybody does across all mediums. It's your overarching plot. So a game like Force Unleashed told the story of Darth Vader's secret apprentice set between the 2 trilogies. It's your characters. So again, in that game, things like Darth Vader's secret apprentice, Vader, his sidekicks, various other characters. And then it's your setting or your world. And obviously with Force Unleashed, we were dealing with Star Wars as our setting. So that's all pretty straightforward. I think everybody kind of can wrap their heads around that. Every medium that tells stories has some kind of, some of these elements or all of these elements included. But what makes us really special as an industry is the way that we can deliver narrative and the storytelling techniques that we can use. And this is why I'm in games and not, doing comic book writing or screenwriting or something full time. It's because we have so many different ways that we can explore how we deliver stories. So it ranges obviously from things like cinematics and mission briefings and kind of all the traditional methods, also core gameplay, which I think that we underestimate as a storytelling tool quite often. Dialogue trees, scripted events, enemies, AI behaviors, your UI, your macro systems. These are all the types of things that we would use in a game like Force Unleashed. There's many, many more than that. I'm going to just touch on a few of these as we go through the rest of the presentation, but I'd like to everybody keep that in mind that, again, as game developers, we have this massive palette for the way that we can tell stories, and I don't think that we tap into it as well as we could across the board. So as I started thinking about story after coming off of Mafia 3, Mafia 3 was lauded for its story. It was pretty successful from that regard, the plot in particular, and a lot of the writing, the quality of the cinematics. We really strove or made great efforts to try and involve the player in that story as well and make them the co-author of the experience as much as possible. But there were definitely some areas where we fell down in terms of the storytelling across the board. So I wanted to try and find a kind of process or a system or a structure that we could take and not only apply to the overarching plot, but apply to all areas of story development throughout the game. And it turns out, after lots of kind of research and thought on it and exploration, sometimes the simplest answers are the best solutions. So I went back to what is called the story mountain. And if you've done any kind of research or reading on story or storytelling, this is going to look pretty familiar to you. But the story mountain, in my mind, always starts with a theme. And that theme is basically where are you going and why are you going there? And I'll talk a little bit more about each of these beats in a minute. And then the story mountain breaks down into 5 big beats. You have your beginning, your intro, your setup, what is called the rising action, your climax, which usually includes a lot of complications or twists and turns, and then your falling action, and then your resolution. So again, I'm going to go through each of these in a little bit more detail as I talk about the different types of stories that we can tell as we go through the game. But what was so important to me is that I can look at this and it's very simple, it's easy to remember, and it allows us to kind of create a common language within the studio across all sites in order to talk about story, whether we're talking about the overarching story of the game or the story of a mission or even the story of an enemy, which I'll talk about in a little bit. It's also very compatible with other structures too. So just if you're using a 3-act structure or 5-act structure or any of the other more traditional structures, that story mountain fits within any of those as well. So it also makes it useful from that standpoint. All right, so using Mafia 3 as an example for most of these, I want to walk through kind of an overarching plot. This would be what we might call a macro story. Again, almost every game that has any kind of story has some kind of plot, so most of this should be pretty familiar to everybody. But for us, we started with a theme, and that I think is really important and something that's too often overlooked. And for the macro plot, I usually like to start with an overarching theme, and that is a question that you can actually debate as you go throughout the game. And in this case, we use this theme, which again isn't incredibly new or innovative. There's lots of movies and other media or sources that have this theme, but the whole notion of do you have to become the monster in order to destroy the monster was something that we wanted to explore. And we wanted to debate throughout the game with 2 characters. We have a character named Father James, who's a priest that raised Lincoln Clay, our main character, and then another guy named John Donovan, who's a CIA agent that Lincoln met in Vietnam. And they both kind of represent different sides of that coin, and they debate it as you go throughout the whole game. So we started with the theme, and then we wanted to introduce our character and our plot. And a lot of times in games, this is done through cinematics. It might be done through a text crawl. It's done through your opening missions. We used a combination of missions and cinematics in Mafia 3 in order to introduce Lincoln Clay and the central plot and the big problem that Lincoln will face and have to overcome throughout the game. So when you first meet Lincoln, he's fresh back from Vietnam. He's agreed to work with the mob back in the city called New Bordeaux, which is our version of New Orleans, in order to do a bank heist. And by the end of that kind of intro phase of the game, he's betrayed by the mob and he's left for dead, and that really sets him off on his path for revenge. And a lot of stories you would call, or a lot of structures, you might call that the inciting incident. This is the moment where everything changes for Lincoln and his mission kind of becomes at least partially clear and he knows what he has to do moving forward. So that's kind of the intro setup. And next we move into what's called the rising action period. And the bulk of games, this is the bulk of the game. So this is most of the story in many games. It's most of the story in many movies and many novels. And it's really as the period of time that the protagonist is working towards that climax, working towards resolution of the central conflict, which again in this case was tearing down the mob in New Bordeaux. So in Mafia 3, this included a lot of missions, this included a lot of exploration, included a lot of encounters, activities, a number of other content that all told smaller stories, but it fed into this overall fantasy of Lincoln getting revenge on the mob. We also ended this phase with our first big revelation. I think it's a good idea to try and bookend your kind of climax of the game with some twists and some turns and some complications. So the big revelation that Lincoln learns at the end of kind of the rising action is that Sal Marcano, who's the head of the mob, has been trying to put together a casino north of the city, which would threaten to, basically take over the city and put him in an amazing place of power within the larger mob organization. Oh, sorry, there's some pretty pictures. Sorry, Rob, I forgot to click through all these. So there you go. There's the casino that Lincoln ultimately goes after at the end of the game. So that brings us to the climax and the complication. In the case of mini games, this is kind of your penultimate mission. This might be your big boss fight. For us, we kind of wanted to turn it on its ear a little bit with Mafia III. So we do have a big shootout at the casino that you go to. There's a big dramatic moment where Lincoln has to confront the guy that actually shot him in the head, who's Sal Marcano's son. But ultimately, when Lincoln confronts Sal, it's really more of a sit-down. It's a conversation between these two guys about how similar they are and the ways in which Lincoln's story could have been very similar to Sal's had he been raised slightly different or had a different situation growing up. But then we still do allow a moment for the player to make a final decision around the fate for Sal, either through action or inaction. If you decide to kill him, there's like 5 or 6 different ways you can execute him. If you do nothing, Sal kills himself because you've taken away everything from him leading up into the climax. And then we move into the 4th phase, which is the falling action phase. And this is probably the most misunderstood of all the phases in the story mountain. A lot of people look at that and think, oh, well, not much happens there. There's not much drama. It's really just filler content before you get to the end. And that's not really true. You can actually have twists and turns here as well. But the key is that you want to make sure that the player feels like, or the reader or whatever story you're trying to tell, they feel like they're headed towards that conclusion. It's almost that kind of freight train towards the end. In the case of Mafia III, Lincoln's given control over the city, and the player can go back to the city and explore, complete any content that they haven't completed up until that point. But they also discover they have one big decision left to make, and that's determining the final fate of their allies and then the city itself. So at the end of the game, you have 3 choices that you get to make. Some of this is driven by choices you've made leading up to this point, but you can decide to either execute your allies, which at that point you become the monster in the case of our theme. We really wanted to try and use all these resolutions to answer the question posed by the theme and to allow the player to kind of have a stake in that and to answer the question for themselves. So you can become the monster by killing your allies, in which case Father James plants a bomb under your car and kills you. Because he can't bear the thought that you've turned into something worse than Sal Marcano. You can decide to rule the city with your allies, and you turn it into kind of the Las Vegas of the South. Or you can leave town, and then you leave it in control of one of your allies. And it's really the ally that you've spent the most time and effort kind of building up over the course of the game. So decisions going back all the way to that rising action phase kind of have impact as you come to the resolution. So again, that's kind of the overarching plot of Mafia III mapped against this story mountain, but the key here is we really did try to make the player the co-author as much as possible. So if you look at kind of a typical playthrough, it might look something like this, where players spend a fair amount of time in that rising action before they get to a climax, and then they go straight from that climax into the resolution, and in this case chose to kill their allies and then got blown up in the car in return. Other characters, though, might have blown, or other players might have blown through that rising action phase and got through all the content as quickly as possible, just done the bare minimum to make progress as they went. Then they got to the climax earlier and made a different choice at the end. And again, you can see that there's many more variations of this. You can layer literally hundreds of different playthroughs on this and get kind of a different result every time. So moving on to kind of the next type of story, again, I wanted to try and take this template or this mold of the story mountain and see, can we apply it to all kinds of stories, and how would that work? So here we went to a world story, and the theme for New Bordeaux, which was our city, was we wrapped it around this theme of a pulp 1960s New Orleans. And that isn't a question, we're not posing a question there, but we knew that was something evocative that the whole team could wrap their heads around. A lot of times in world stories, they're kind of easy to kick off. You can do it with an intro cinematic. You can do it with an early mission. We used a combination of those tools. Also your journal and a number of other things to give you your kind of intro to the world. And it really started with this very linear mission structure in Act 1. We are an open world game, but we limited all of your exploration early in the game so we could really reinforce the location and give you a sense of kind of time and place where you were at. So we took you from all over the city in those early missions, gave you a taste of everything from the wealthiest districts to the poorest districts, so you could see some of that disparity in wealth. We took you from the swamps, and then we took you to Mardi Gras, and then ended in kind of this above ground cemetery. And the player got, again, a little taste of the dark underbelly of the city as well. Again, there's racism was alive and well in 1960s New Bordeaux. You got a taste of that. You got a taste of kind of the violence. You got a taste of the wealth disparity. But in general, we were trying to make it kind of a fun gangster romp in that first act, and that was intentional to kind of draw the player in to this idea of a pulp New Orleans. And then we move on to our rising action section, which for us meant that we were unlocking a number of different districts for the player. So again, in the bulk of games, I think, especially games that have larger worlds, this is really a lot of exploration. The player goes out and figures out how the world works. They encounter new areas. They learn all the backstory and the history. For us, we unlocked a number of different districts, each with their own story in their own right. And I'm obviously not going to go through all of them or even one example today, but each one did have its own story, its own backstory, its own beginning, middle, and end, its rising action, its complication. We also found other ways to tell story throughout the game. We had a number of radio stations, and we tried to layer in as much story to the overarching world and the individual districts as you walked through them or went through them through the radio stations. And then we used collectibles as well, so not only to reinforce the time and the place, but also the events that were unfolding around you. We probably could have done some of these collectibles were an afterthought. We did them very late. We could have done a much better job with these, but it was a way for a player to get a little bit more context and backstory if they wanted them for everything that they were doing. The other thing that we tried to do is make sure that the districts were unlocking at a faster clip as you went throughout the game, as much as we possibly could, and that gave you the sense that you were moving rapidly towards the climax, or you were building up to something at the end. And then we unlocked increasingly darker districts as you went along. The last couple districts that you encounter end with some of our most violent and kind of darkest content. We have a clan rally that Lincoln has to infiltrate and kind of wipe out. There's this really weird LSD party going on at the country club and some other things. So by the time you get to the complication at the beginning of the climax, you've already seen and really realized that there's this crazy dark underbelly to New Bordeaux. And then we get to the climax and the complication. And for here, in terms of the world story, it really maps closely to the plot story. Lincoln finds out that there's this casino being built up in the north, and we give the player an opportunity to go to this location they haven't been able to access before. They've spent literally hours driving all across the city. We had no fast travel, which many of the reviews pointed out multiple times. But we thought that that was important in order to really immerse the player in the world and to give them the sense that they were becoming familiar with the game world, because at the end of the game, we send you to a brand new location that you have no familiarity with. You're completely kind of on your own, and maybe a little out of your depth when you first get there. So we send the player to outside the city for this final kind of confrontation, and at the same time, we introduce this concept that the world is at stake here, that if Sal succeeds, if he survives, he's going to build this casino, he's going to turn the whole North Shore into kind of Las Vegas to the south, and he's going to do that on the back of all the workers in the city of New Bordeaux. So the city's going to kind of go downhill if this casino project actually gets off the ground. So there is a threat to the world in addition to the threat to Lincoln in the plot. So there's a little bit of casino shots. So once Lincoln resolves the story at the casino, we now hit the falling action period. This is probably something we could have done a little bit better as well. Ideally, at that climax moment, you have some world state change. You have something happen to the world that where it's not just a little bit better off than it was before. We didn't really do that in Mafia III, so there wasn't a lot to go back and explore afterwards to see how the world had changed. I think that's a big missed opportunity in that game, and I think it's something that other games can look to do better moving forward. But in general, that would be the falling action and kind of a world story as you go back and you see how has the world changed based on the choices or the actions that I did at the climax of the game. And then you're on the road to the resolution. And again, for us, the resolution was tied pretty closely to the plot overall, where we basically had these three choices that you can make. Again, if you end up getting killed, the city itself has a chance because there's no mobsters running it anymore. It can actually start to recover and maybe move in a different direction. If you take it over, you expand your more power over New Bordeaux to the whole south, and actually Lincoln rebuilds sections of the city that were important to him. And then if you leave, the city dramatically transforms under the rule of one of your 3 lieutenants. Burke, who's this Irish gangster, turns it into this crazy Wild West, cocaine-fueled shootout. And Cassandra goes to war with the government, and it becomes this kind of militarized zone. So it can go dramatically different ways depending on the decisions. And again, the player is the co-author here, so depending on the way the player moves through the game and the choices they make, they might have very different arcs. Now, a little bit of a confession here. We didn't actually use this story mountain very often in Mafia III, especially around the world. And had we done that, we may have been able to see that we were actually spending way too much time in the rising action period of the game. One of the knocks against the game was that it got a little bit grindy and repetitive in the district loop that we had. That was, in hindsight, something that we might have been able to catch had we looked at the balance of rising action versus the other beats. The other thing was we gated progress through the districts by forcing you to kind of do activities which slowed down that kind of arc and that sense that you were moving towards the climax. So at the very least, had we removed some of those restrictions later in the game, you would have moved towards that climax faster, and it might have been overall a more experience with more sense of propulsion to it. Okay, so moving on to another version of a macro story. This is our character story. I think some games do this really, really well, especially games that have companion characters and characters you can spend a lot of time with. I think the trick here is you want to look at the character as the protagonist of the story. There's a cliche that the best villains are the heroes in their own story. So looking at every character as if they're the hero in their own story, I think is important. So as I walk through this, I'm going to try and talk about Burke, who's one of our characters, as if it was his story, because that's the way we kind of looked at it. Again, we started with the theme. In this case, our theme was Broken Mobster, and when you first meet Burke, we introduce him through a series of cinematics in the early part of the game. He's broken both kind of socially and physically. He's had his kneecap busted by Marcano's goons because of some mission that he failed in the past. He's also a product of his time and his place, so he's racist, he's sexist, he's misogynistic, he's homophobic, which puts him at odds with Lincoln and his daughter Nikki, who's a lesbian. And that, at the very beginning kind of sets him up for hopefully a redemption arc, depending on the way that the story unfolds over time. But you meet Burke early on. Again, he's trying to prove himself to get back into the good graces of the mob. And so he agrees to participate in the heist, and more than that, he brings in his son Danny, who's the guy in the biker jacket there, in on the mission as well. And Danny's kind of his pride and joy. So when they are betrayed by the mob and Danny actually gets killed, that breaks Burke even further. So then we meet Burke again as Lincoln in the rising action period of the game, and we do this actually through a combination of missions and cinematics. So there's conversations during the missions. There's one mission where you actually have to drive and play a game of chicken in order to prove to Burke that you have a death wish too. And that's what you learn about Burke, is that he's so broken by the death of his son, he's become this just unmitigated drunk, and he's got a death wish, and Lincoln convinces him to channel that death wish into taking on Marcano. But the real moment for Burke in this rising action isn't necessarily deciding to take on take on Marcano, but is joining forces with Lincoln, because as the rising action kind of mounts, he eventually confides in Lincoln that he is doing work for the IRA. He wants to steal cars to turn them into car bombs and kind of prove himself to the IRA and hopefully get some money from them. Now, this is what I think is kind of most interesting about Burke's story, is that content, which is introduced towards the end of kind of the rising action period, is completely optional. The player can completely ignore it, in which case they don't ever get to the complication or climax of Burke's story, or it's a different climax, which I'll talk about in a minute. But if you do decide to do the IRA missions, you ultimately kind of prove your loyalty to Burke, and Burke confides in you. He's not really working for the IRA. He's trying to steal these cars and sell them to another buyer so that he can build a big nest egg for his daughter Nikki, because Burke is dying of cancer. So Burke gives you this very emotional revelation. He confides in Lincoln as his friend, and that's kind of the big turning point and twist in Burke's story, and kind of the high point of the drama, if you've done that side content. And then we get to the following action. So even if you do all that side content, Burke is still one of your allies, he's still one of your lieutenants, and he's constantly vying for rackets and for money and territory with the other lieutenants. So he's trying to really make sure that he has a place in New Bordeaux if you decide to leave or if you get killed, and that's Burke's kind of plot line in the following action. If you don't do that side mission content for him, there's every possibility that he'll ultimately abandon you if you don't give him enough territory, and that can become the climax or major conflict or twist of the story. And then again, we have multiple resolutions for Burke's story. Again, if you have not done any of the side content, ultimately Burke will, and you don't give him any territory, Burke will betray you, and Lincoln has to hunt him down and kill him. If you do that side content and then ultimately leave the city and entrust it to Burke, he turns it into this crazy Wild West. He ends up getting a liver transplant, and he survives for 6 more years and gets killed in a shootout in the city. And then if you decide to work or stay in the city, he becomes a loyal ally and continues to run the districts that you've given him, provided that he survived up until that point. So this one's a little bit more dramatic in terms of the number of options for the player. We only put 3 examples there, but again, whether or not you do that side content dramatically changes your perception of Burke's story and what happens to him, and changes the possible outcomes, and then obviously your choices at the end of the game can change that as well. So for me, in terms of these macro stories, this is probably the best example of where we made the player the co-author in the experience, although we didn't telegraph it as well as we probably could have, and given players more incentive to do things like the side content. All right, so then going to missions, we do this fairly well as an industry, I think, even if we don't always map missions to any kind of story model. But in general, missions have a beginning, a middle, and end in most games. For us, again, we started everything with a theme. So here we're going to talk about a mission called Kill Richie that we really rallied around this theme of a haunted carnival. So again, not a question, but something we knew the team could rally around and could make evocative and realize for everything we did in the mission. So we started out again with that theme. The intro and setup is pretty straightforward. It's a mission briefing you get with Cassandra. She tells you, hey, Lincoln, this guy Richie, one of Marcano's goons, is holed up in this old abandoned theme park. Why don't you go take him out? The one things we did in order to enhance this was that we did a forced time of day change as you got closer to the mission start, so that it happened at night because we wanted to capture the sense of the haunted carnival. And then we got into the intro setup phase, and for us, this intro setup phase was very much about the kind of a slower pace. We wanted to kind of ease you in, so the very first kind of shot you have is from a sniper perch, and you can see the whole carnival or the theme park laid out in front of you, and start to kind of pick and choose your targets and where you want to go. And that becomes the beginning of the rising action. So early in the mission, it's very easy to stealth. We wanted to encourage you to really kind of soak in the atmosphere. We wanted you to feel like it wasn't a very difficult mission early on. It's one of the earlier missions in the game. We wanted you to get a sense of who the enemies were as you went through it, and really, again, kind of immerse you in this haunted carnival. But ultimately, it might be a little hard to see, but you ultimately have to make your way through that giant head there, which is Baron Saturday, who's the mascot for the park, and make your way through that, and then that funnels you into more difficult combat, tighter combat spaces, rides that have been turned into combat arenas. But this is also part of the rising action. And then ultimately we get to the complication and the climax, and in a lot of missions that might be a boss fight, it might be the toughest bit of combat that you have, it's often a combat arena or a big set piece moment. We actually wanted to stretch out because of the notion of this haunted carnival. We wanted to stretch out the climax a little bit, so we actually funnel you into a dark ride called the Revenge of the Bayou Beast, which tells a story of this werewolf-like creature, and you're on foot moving your way through this kind of creepy haunted dark ride to really drive home this notion of the haunted carnival, but also to take away some of the tools that you had before. You don't have clear line of sight. The visibility's cut down a ton. Most of the enemies are shotgunners who come around the corner and blast you if you're not too careful. So it's our most difficult combat, I think, anywhere in the game up until that point. So we're really trying to, kind of get your heart racing as you move deeper and deeper into this ride, this dark ride. And the other thing I really love about this set piece, and we didn't do this enough in the game, but it's something I want to try and do moving forward more and more often, is that we have a story within a story within a story. So there's the overarching plot, and Lincoln is actually in this haunted carnival in order to kill this guy Richie. There's the theme park itself, which you learn if you explore was built by the white people of New Bordeaux in order to keep the black people from going to the beaches, but then they let it kind of just rot and they abandoned it. And then there is the story of the ride, which tells this story of this kind of werewolf-like creature, and the story's got a lot of racist overtones, and it kind of reinforces the time period and the place and the story we were trying to tell overall. And then we end up with the falling action. So again, for us, the falling action was actually the confrontation with Richie. It's almost an afterthought at that point. The big test for you was surviving the trip through the ride itself. So when you go in, you get a little shootout with Richie, but it's mostly a pretty quick kill and takedown. And then we end up with our resolution, which again here was a pretty straightforward cinematic where Lincoln strings Richie up from a Ferris wheel. So falling action in other games in terms of missions, a lot of times that can be kind of doubling back. It can be exploration. It can be looking for all the collectibles you haven't found. It can be mopping up. It could be a new wave of enemies that show up kind of unexpectedly if you want to add a little drama there. We did it with this really quick, punchy shootout and then got straight to the resolution. So, most stories look like this. You go really kind of fast up and fast down if you're going in guns blazes, especially. If you want to take a little bit more time with stealth, your rising action is going to take a little bit longer, but you get rewarded with more backstory. You overhear conversations, you find more collectibles, whatnot. But the resolution's always the same in this particular mission. All right, moving on. We had a number of encounters in the game as well. An encounter I would define as any time you have more than one enemy that you would kind of roll up on. We had literally hundreds of these in Mafia 3, most games do. In most cases, we don't wrap these in story. I think this is another missed opportunity for us as an industry. Encounters are usually just filler. They're there, especially random encounters, for you to grind, get XP, get loot, whatever. But I really want to try and focus moving forward on how we tell a story with every single encounter, whether that's through systemic AI, through barks, through conversations, or through scripted moments, or ideally a combination of both. And the best example I have is from Mafia 3. We had this encounter called, that we just called the concrete coffin. The setup was really simple. You go out and you steal some money from a construction site. That's it. I don't even think there was a mission briefing on this or any kind of VO associated with it. It literally was just an icon on the map that said, hey, there's money here to steal. So that was the setup for us, which is fine. A lot of setups can just be you roll up on some guys and they're having a conversation. In this case, it was a UI element that hopefully propelled you to go investigate this location. The rising action with this particular encounter and pretty much all the encounters in Mafia 3 and many other games, I think, that allow for multiple play styles really varied a lot depending on your play style. So you could go in guns blazing, in which case the whole experience changes, or you could stealth your way in, and again, the climax would be different depending on what you decide to do. So once you make your way in to the kind of construction area, no matter how you go in, you always make your way into this area under an overpass, which we felt like a giant concrete coffin. So again, going back to that kind of reinforcing of the theme. If you have stealthed your way in, the climax for you is you encounter some mobsters executing a guy that's late on payments and getting ready to push him into a pit. And you can interact with that event. You can ignore it, steal the money. The money's sitting literally right there, so you can just grab it and leave and let this guy get executed and pushed into the pit. If you've gone in guns blazing, however, you never see that because they immediately execute the guy and then they come rushing out to fight you, and they call in reinforcements who come from kind of the other side, so you get kind of boxed in. So depending on how you play, this climax can be very, very different. And then the falling action as a result is very different as well. So in contrast to the mission, which had this kind of linear falling action and that everybody experienced, here the falling action would vary depending on how you played the game up until that point. So if you went in guns blazing, likely your falling action was just getting the hell out of there with the bag of money and maybe shooting some guys on your way out. Maybe you call in muscle of your own. Maybe you try and lose some guys so you can switch into stealth and take them out. If you've snuck your way in and haven't really set off any action at that point, you literally can just sneak your way out, right? And your falling action is just being careful to not be spotted on your way out. Or you can open up fire and take some guys out on your way out and then really change the whole dynamic of the mission as well. And then the resolution was very, very simple for pretty much all of our encounters. It was a little UI ding and told you how much money you made, how much damage you did to Marcano's operations. Really, really simple. I think we can probably do a better job with this across the board and give you a more satisfying resolution, whether that's the world reacting to things that you've done, reports later on of the things that you've done. There's lots of different tools, again, in our bucket for how we approach this. But we took a pretty simple and straightforward approach that seemed to work for Mafia III. One missed opportunity here, though, was that I would have loved to have the resolution and the falling action take into account your interaction with the guy on the edge of the pit. You could shoot him, in which case he would just fall into the pit and then the guys would turn on you. You could save him by killing everybody around him, but nothing really happened with that, and it never came back around at all. So that's one moment where we could have taken that scripted beat and applied it to either other story going forward or to the resolution period, even if it was just a greater reward. So again, depending on how the player plays through this, they always get that same resolution, but the rising action, the falling action, the climax are all significantly different. All right, so the kind of last out of these big stories is what I would call the enemy story. And this is the one that I'm actually kind of most excited about moving forward and exploring as much as we can moving forward. At Hangar 13, we're actually investing a lot in systemic group AI, partly so that we can enhance some of those encounter stories and add additional twists and turns beyond just the traditional things like spawn ads and or reinforcements arriving or an enemy, a group of enemies suddenly coming down on you, and instead, again, use new tactics and introduction of changing behaviors based on what the player is doing, both at the enemy level and at the encounter level. But this is an area that I think is, as an industry, we're really hit and miss. Bosses, major lieutenants, major characters, I think we put a lot of thought into what their story might be, both from a narrative standpoint and the story that the player experiences. But in terms of archetypes, especially enemies you encounter again and again and again, we put very little thought into this beyond just, do they challenge the player in some new way, which is important. But I think if we can think about enemy design through the lens of the story mountain, we're going to get more interesting enemies, and then they'll combine in more interesting ways as well. So again, we are admittedly hit and miss on this with Mafia III as well, but one in hindsight that I think we did a fairly good job on was what we call the Trigger Man. So the theme around the Trigger Man was he was the rat, which we also would maybe translate into the resourceful nuisance. So he wasn't necessarily meant to be a huge threat to the player. He's the weakest enemy, he's the most abundant, he's a low priority target in general. If you're faced with a shotgun or a sniper and a Trigger Man, you're gonna pretty much ignore the Trigger Man for the most part because he's only armed with that little pea shooter. We introduce the enemy in games in general through things like, cutaways, animations. They come in and they mash their swords together so you're about to fight a melee guy. Little cinematics. In Mafia 3, we actually wanted to move away from that and try and introduce the enemies more organically. And that had pros and cons, to be fair. But the most likely intro to a Trigger Man in Mafia 3 would be kind of rolling up on a group of them and overhearing their conversations. And you would hear that they're talking about normal stuff. They're talking about problems with their wives and girlfriends. They're making crude jokes. They're talking about how much they hate the boss and how shitty their jobs are. And as you get further in the game, they're talking about how afraid they are of Lincoln Clay and that he's going to show up and kill them. So there's nothing about their conversations and certainly their appearance that would suggest that they were a threat. And we kind of carry that into the rising action. So Again, rising action for an enemy can be their early behaviors. With the case of the triggermen, as soon as you open fire, they would immediately go into kind of nuisance mode. So we emphasize that over the resourceful part early on. So they would take cover, they would blind fire a lot. They wouldn't pop out of cover very often unless, you know, kind of there weren't a lot of other enemies around. If they did hit you, they didn't do a ton of damage. Really, their only threat was distracting you from a bigger enemy nearby, which was exactly what their role was supposed to be. So again, the story of this enemy is they're, again, taking cover, they are kind of being a nuisance to the player, but not doing anything overtly aggressive. And then this is where I think we can do a lot better job in the industry as a whole, is what is the kind of twist or the climax or the complication of an enemy design. And for, again, if you're fighting a boss in most games, we do this okay, right? You know, you get halfway through the boss fight and suddenly they get new powers, or they get that mysterious second health bar, or a new wave of allies show up to help them, or whatever. But we put very little thought into this on the individual archetypes, and we tried to with Mafia III with a handful of them, and the Triggerman was one of them. So the things that we did with the Triggerman to make sure that he had kind of a little twist to him and could provide that kind of climax moment in a battle is first, aside from his primary weapon, which again was just that little pea shooter, he was the only character in the game that could throw Molotovs. So if the player was slowing down combat and making that rising action kind of stall into a halt because they were turtling up, the Triggerman could actually drive them out of cover with a Molotov or with a grenade. Second, they were the only enemy in the game that could pick up other enemies' weapons. So if you were to kill a shotgunner near a Triggerman, they would actually come out of cover long enough to grab that shotgun and then go back. And in some ways, the combination of those two things made the Triggerman, for really brief windows, one of the deadliest enemies in the game. Because if you have an enemy that can drive you out of cover and then shoot you in the face with a shotgun, they're going to do a ton of damage and be a huge threat to the player. So we thought that was a really nice twist with this character, and again, could add this kind of sense of drama and this kind of peak to combat. But then there's also the falling action. So none of the attributes around the Triggerman change, even if he's got a shotgun. He doesn't suddenly become a shotgunner. So all of his other behaviors remain intact. He's still really easy to drive back into cover. He's very easy to stagger. If you hit him with a glancing shot, he wanders around, you know, wounded forever, and he's easy to kind of take out as a result. If you kill somebody brutally nearby him, he gets all stunned and scared. So once you kind of realize that, oh, he's changed, he's got a shotgun, you could still rebalance combat by taking a breath and figuring out how you're going to deal with this Triggerman, and he's fairly easy to deal with at that point. And then the resolution, again, in most games, you know, the resolution is pretty much, which in Mafia 3, it's a really great death animation. We can do a lot better here, I think, but we put a ton of effort into our death animation, so everyone was different. They were all dramatic. They were all a reward in and of themselves. You also got money and you got loot and some other stuff, but really the payoff was the death animation. I think that this is another area where if we start to think about it, how do we do better resolutions for these stories? I think that we'll come up with much better ideas over time. You know, the kill spare mechanics in some other games, I think, are one. We did have something in Mafia 3 for a while where you never outright killed anybody. You just left them all rolling around, writhing on the ground. And that was super dark and disturbing. So we ended up, I don't know, we didn't completely turn it off, did we, Josh? But we didn't completely turn it off, but it wasn't nearly as pervasive as it was originally. But there was something kind of interesting in that, where the resolution was in the player's hands at that point of what to do with these characters. Another confession with the Triggerman to say are that I felt like we did a really good job with the design on paper, all the way up maybe to the resolution. We did a bad job in execution with this. I don't think any players realized that the Triggerman was the only character that could throw Molotovs and grenades, or that they picked up weapons. It just kind of happened in the chaos of combat. And that was because we didn't telegraph it very well. We never tutorialized it. And we made a change at the 11th hour in development where we turned snap to target on by default. So all combat became much easier. So you weren't incentivized to learn the behaviors of these characters and the way that we had originally intended. So hindsight being 2020, you know, we would have left the game more difficult, and we would have found ways to telegraph this. In contrast, we had an archetype called the Squealer who could run and get reinforcements, and we tutorialized that. We put a big icon over his head when he was doing it. The reinforcements that rolled in were no joke. They were a big threat that you wanted to actually deal with. So the Squealer was a much more effective archetype for us at the end of the day, even though on paper the design for the Triggerman was a lot more interesting. The only other thing I'd note about the resolution, the one thing I did think was nice about the resolutions we did was we had this mechanic in the game where if you killed somebody really violently in front of another enemy, that enemy would be likely to be stunned for a moment, and the triggermen were perfect for that. So players that kind of learned to do that, they always saw the triggermen as like a resource for this other power that they had, which was putting everybody into a kind of a fear state. So again, depending on how you approach combat with the triggerman, your story could be dramatically different from mine or from other players. So those are all kind of the big stories. I don't really have time to talk about systems, but I'd love to do that at some point. Maybe it's a whole talk. But I think thinking about stories in terms of how do we apply it to a game mechanic, how do we apply a beginning, middle, and end, to a game mechanic, to a macro system, to a micro system, to how UI unfolds, I think would be incredibly helpful. But the real trick to all this is finding a way to nest it. If you think about every element as a story, then naturally they're going to start nesting. And what happens is you have your enemies. So again, we had multiple enemies in every encounter, and they nest within an encounter. I think it's probably really hard to see because of the light, sorry. But then you have multiple encounters in a mission. So something like that Haunted Carnival, we literally had a dozen different encounters that were discrete encounters that were both a combination of systemic and scripted moments. And then obviously a number of missions combined into that overall world story, which is then populated by your characters. And then that all folds into the overarching plot. But the big trick is if you have, again, player agency within all of those and a way for the player to kind of determine how quickly do they get to the peak, what do they do during the following action, what is their resolution to each of these stories, you end up with something that doesn't look like the traditional story mountain, but more like a mountain range. So, and this is really, I think, what our goal is, because at the end of the day, I think, again, we want everything to tell a story, but you also want every player's story to be unique. And this is, I think, the best way to get there, especially if you're doing something that's more narrative heavy like we're trying to do at Hangar 13. So again, moving forward, I think we did some of these things well in Mafia 3, but moving forward, we're going to be doing it across the board with every story that we can tell. So just to wrap it up, a couple big lessons that we learned. A lot of this is hindsight, looking back at Mafia 3 in particular. First, don't overthink the theme. Again, when you look up Story Mountain online, nobody talks about themes, so think about it, make sure it's there, and I think it's something that if you do nothing else, put a theme on all your enemies, because that's going to help you kind of differentiate them and give you little mini stories that you can tell as you go through it. But don't overthink it. They don't all have to be questions. It just needs to be something evocative and cool that the team can rally around. Don't be afraid of player agency. I think especially when we're doing narrative-heavy games, we don't want the player to go off the rails. This is what makes our medium special, and I think giving players opportunity to have micro choices and macro choices is hugely important. But conversely, don't go to the other extreme either, and don't be afraid to define the outcomes of those choices and put the player into a box. So obviously, if you completely ignore the triggerman, he's going to shoot you with a shotgun, right? And the outcome is you're going to die. So, and you can also define outcomes like, if you decide to be the monster in Mafia 3, for us, it was really important that that outcome felt true to the story that we were telling. So you get blown up in a car by Father James. There is no happy ending I don't think there's any happy ending for Lincoln, the main character, to be honest. But there's no happy ending in that scenario. He doesn't end up sitting on a throne of, bone and blood. And then the last one, which I already talked about, but just expose the stories too. Find ways to make sure that the player actually realizes what's happening and start to appreciate them. And this was, I think, the biggest learning for me from Mafia 3. So that's it. Maybe next year I'll come back and talk about systems in particular, because we had a couple more slides for that, or milestones. You can use the same structure for milestones as well, with a beginning, middle, and end, and kind of work your milestones towards a big climax, and then use the last couple weeks as a falling action. And we're actually doing that at Hangar 13 right now as well. But I think that's it, and we're probably out of time for questions. Is that right? I timed it perfect then. Just kidding. I'm kidding. I'll be around outside if anybody does have any questions, but otherwise, thanks a lot. Hope you learned at least one thing, and hope you have a great rest of develop. So thanks.